Land Use and Transportation Planner here at DLCD, and one of the co-project managers of the rulemaking project. And I'll just go around and let the other DLCD folks introduce themselves, starting with Cody.
Hi everyone, Cody Meyer, Land Use Transportation Planner, DLCD. Evan?
Evan Manville, Land Use Transportation Planner at DLCD. Ryan?
Ryan Markwart, also Land Use Transportation Planner with DLCD. Matt?
Matt Kroll, also with DLCD. Ingrid, I guess.
Ingrid Cordell, Advisory Committee Coordinator.
Thank you. If folks could just real briefly introduce themselves and their affiliation as I go around the boxes here. Start with Julie, then Joseph.
Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager with the City of Salem.
Joseph.
Hi, this is Joseph Off at the City of Hillsborough Transportation Systems Division.
Great. Then Paige, then Mallory.
Hi, everybody. Paige West, Senior Planner with Rogue Valley Transit, and I'm still eating my lunch, so I'm going to turn my video off.
No problem.
Thanks, Mallory Roberts with the Association of Oregon Counties.
We've got Mary Kyle, then Peter.
Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Hello, everybody. This is Peter Hurley with the City of Portland. I'm a Senior Policy Planner.
Then Brian, Bob, and Jana.
Hi, I'm Brian Worley. I'm also with the Association of Oregon Counties. Thanks.
Bob, are you able to? Jana, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Jana Jarvis with the Oregon Trucking Associations.
Bob.
And Bob Courtright, I'm working with 1000 Friends and OEC.
Thank you, everybody. And I'll just note that Kevin Young from DLCD staff has also joined us, and he's the co-project manager along with me on this ride. So we're going to go. I just have a handful of slides real quick to go over, including some things that we looked at. You know, some of the discussion that happened at the last meeting. I want to make sure that we touch base on a few things that we talked about at the last meeting here. So let me just bring that up real quick. I promise this is very short. All right. So introductions, we just completed that. Review of issues and scope, we will do that, and then it'll be time for open discussion. This is an informal meeting to discuss ideas and concerns, but be aware that the meeting is being streamed and recorded. So it's not that informal, I guess. Try to be careful about what you say. This will be on YouTube. So what are we talking about when we talk about transportation system planning in terms of the rules that we're talking about? We're talking about essentially rules 100 through 210 in the draft transportation planning rules. There are things probably that they touch other things, and of course we can kind of get into that a little bit, but some of the other things we've been talking about with other work groups are really are different pieces that we're trying to get through those. We're not really talking about the Metro piece 102. We're not really talking about the engagement equity pieces, although people are interested in talking about that, we could. There's some other little bits and pieces here and there that don't really make sense on connected transportation planning so much. And part of this is we're going to do some renumbering to make it a little bit more sense when we're all done. And then 170, we left to a different work group. So that's kind of the scope of the rules that we're talking about. We are, like I said, going to expect to renumber some of these rules a little bit, move things around just to kind of make a little bit more sense, hopefully. There's rules they're very well connected with transportation system planning that have to do with modal planning, whether either it's pedestrian, bicycle, transit, or street planning. And that we have a separate work group for that. So we're going to meet tomorrow morning on that for another work group. Overall, our objective here is to make sure our updated transportation system plans meet our climate and equity objectives. We want to make sure that we're centering the voices of underserved people in decision making, that we're meeting our targets for climate pollution reduction, including VMT reduction, And part of that is making sure that we're shifting the focus of our planning to the wide range of modes of transportation and not being too focused on just one form of transportation. We want to make sure our rules are clear, that transportation system planning is coordinated with other planning that's happening, and that we're avoiding unnecessary work. Like I said, this is from before too. We expect to reorganize and renumber some of the rules in here. Some of these things, a lot of these things are pieces that were already in existing rules, and we're still kind of finessing that a little bit. But I think we're getting pretty close to making sure that we've got the pieces that we need. And then we want, overall the organization of the rules to be clear and make sense. So here's the big slide for today is the stuff that we heard after the last meeting, and that I think we expect to make some tweaks to the draft rules in response to. The first one is, we had some discussion about project prioritization in our project lists. I think the way the rules are written right now, it's not real clear, or maybe it's a little too prescriptive, saying you have to have prioritize 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 all the way through the project list. And there was some discussion at the last meeting about allowing some tierings, like first, second, third, fourth, fifth levels, and have groups of projects within those tiers. I think that's probably workable within our framework. We just need to be clear in the rules that that's going to be okay, and how to do that. So we do agree with that, and we're going to make that change. The second bullet is simplifying the process for developing the financially constrained list. I think it came up that it was a bit mechanistic and pretty specific about how that was supposed to happen, about how you took projects from the illustrative list and put them on the financially constrained list. I think we can do some simplification there, give local governments the flexibility to do that in a way that makes sense. Some projects in the illustrative list may be used in conjunction with development. I think this also came up at the last meeting, where it was pretty clear that the financially constrained list doesn't necessarily include all the projects that were going to be developed, potentially, in particular, because of projects in conjunction with development. And it's hard to know exactly which developments are going to go through, and sometimes you want to be able to have projects in the plan that you can hold developers responsible for doing, if it's in conjunction with the work that they're doing. So I think we're open to that, and making sure that we'll probably have some sideboards on that, but making sure that local governments have the flexibility to use projects from the illustrative list in those contexts. So we're open to that, doing that as well. Came up that Rule 50, maybe we forgot or neglected, or something that we had said that just applied outside of metropolitan areas in the way the draft rules were written. But it's pretty clear that needs to continue to apply statewide, including inside and outside metropolitan areas. So we're going to continue to do that. So that's really not too much of a change from existing practice, but kind of continuing those project development pieces, and allowing local governments in metropolitan areas to continue to do that, which is necessary. And then the last one is really, we spent a lot of time talking about the timing of all these things, what has to be done when, and we opened this up in the last advisory committee meeting packet, that we would potentially talk about allowing local governments to request a work program from the department or the commission. I can't remember exactly where we lined up on that, but to implement the rules over the next few years. So making sure that we're meeting the urgent need to do the updates and changes that are necessary in the short term, but also balancing that with the fact that local governments are in different places, have existing things that are existing plans in different states, and different levels of other things that are happening. So making sure that we're able to fit in these things that need to happen in the short term without necessarily having rigid timelines. So we are going to have a rule that gives local governments that flexibility. So I just wanted to put that out there. Yeah, we've heard a lot of what happened at the last meeting, and these are the things I think we agreed that we will be able to make some changes on. But as far as that is my last slide. I don't have a lot of other detailed stuff to talk about. I think I'm just going to kind of throw it out there. I don't know if other folks have other things you'd like to talk about or bring up. All right, Joseph. Folks, go ahead and use the under your reactions tab, the raised hand like Joseph did, and that way we know that you would like to speak. Joseph.
Hi, this is Joseph Off at the City of Hillsborough. I just would like a clarification about the illustrative list, because there was that conversation in our last meeting about how we have projects in our TSP that we don't put on the financially constrained list. And I'm just kind of looking a little bit more for clarity. I'm just going to kind of give examples, but usually our projects on the financially constrained list are usually bigger projects. And then we have projects in our TSP, which are different needs. And I just want to throw kind of an example out here and to see if that would be something that would fall underneath the illustrative list. But we, in our current TSP and the one that we're about to adopt soon, we have these things called connectivity maps where we basically try to connect like neighborhoods to trails to, or we have like, we have, history in the past that we are now correcting both like, cul-de-sac neighborhoods in a sense, and then trying to connect it so they have walking paths to trails or to other parts of the neighborhood. And so we try to tie it to development, get it into the TSP as a connectivity map, and then have it, if the site redevelops, have it as a easement. But I guess our understanding basically is that we don't have it in our TSP, then we can't require when someone redevelops a site to provide that easement for a walking and ped path. And is that something that would fall underneath the illustrative list? I mean, it's not really like a list of projects, it's a map that we pretty much generally have in our TSP that kind of saying these are where we'd like to have it when the site redevelops. So I'm just kind of curious, how would that play out with the way the rules are written?
Yeah, so I like to think of the illustrative list as everything, right? The whole big list of everything that you might include in the financially constrained list is a subset of the illustrative list. Yeah, I mean, for those type of projects where you don't, and for local projects, you don't necessarily have to have a specific location or anything, but kind of those small scale local projects. Yeah, I expect those are kind of going to be called out in that illustrative list. Yeah, that does make sense. Is that what you're asking? I guess I'm a little confused. You kind of went all over the place, or I'm all over the place. But could you restate your question real quick? I'm sorry.
I guess I guess when I was looking at it, the TPR revision before, it sounded like the illustrative list was like a set of projects that had to fit underneath a certain criteria. But I just wanted to see if we can, like, using like the connectivity maps as an example, is that something that we incorporate into the illustrative list because we're trying to better connect our neighborhoods to other walking facilities, et cetera. I guess because right now we have a financially constrained list in our that we submit to Metro, and that's what we use for kind of our bigger projects. But we have our smaller scope projects that are not like on like an official naming list, but it's identified as a need in our TSP. So I guess I'm just looking for confirmation, and that would be what's like using like the connectivity maps as an example. That would be what would fall into the realm of illustrative list. But I guess the other question there too is if we have like little small scale things like adding turn lanes, which we don't really submit on the financially constrained list to Metro, would that also fall on the illustrative list as well?
Yeah, I think that's the idea, is that there's a little bit of even the small things are on that illustrative list. And am I understanding that you've got this connectivity map? Are those showing specific sites, or is it more of a policy based thing, or?
There are maps in our TSP right now where it kind of like shows an arrow, and we have like a tax lot map, and it kind of shows an arrow kind of over a certain tax lot that we would like someday to provide some type of path connection just to provide better network within our community. And that's so that's what we have today. And so I'm just kind of using that because it's something that we can't, my understanding, we can't require it if it's not shown in TSP, we can't require it when someone redevelops the site. And so that's kind of why it's important to like us to have a project list that shows these needs. And so we can actually, when the site does redevelop, we sit there and going, hey, we need an easement here so we can have a path to connect, this neighborhood to this trail here.
Yeah, so I would say those projects go in your illustrative list. Now, it sounds like it's been the practice of the city to not put smaller projects in the financially constrained list. I think we think of the financially constrained list as the list of projects that you expect to be able to fund in the next 20 years and that you want to do, and based on a prioritization scheme. And I don't think we had considered it being just the big projects or anything like that. And so that may require a little bit of shift in thinking on the part of the city in terms of what the financially constrained list looks like or is for. But I think, like I said earlier, we are considering making that change. I think that we would allow the construction of those projects that are on the illustrative list along with development. So in the cases I think you brought up where you have a developer coming in and wanting to do something and you say, we want to be able to require them to do the pedestrian connection. That's something absolutely we would support. And it may not be on your financially constrained list. It may only be on the illustrative list, and that's okay. I think we could, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we'd be on board with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess it's more of a conversation with Metro. I guess that's just the history. It's more of like if we are doing like a trail project or even just like if we're widening our trail from a 3-lane to a 5-lane facility. That's I was just using those as an example. Those are what usually can see put down in the financially constrained list, or adding it. And so I guess it's more of a conversation, I guess, to have with Metro, because my understanding is it's always kind of more just the bigger type of projects, like adding a transit line or something like that, not little small things here and there. But
so I could see in Metro in particular, maybe jurisdictions having a list that is projects of regional significance, right? Because you can think about there's lots of projects that are bigger and may want to be regional funded versus projects that are smaller and might be locally funded. And the way the TPR is written doesn't really right now, it doesn't make that distinction. It just says things, the financially constrained list are all the things that expect to be funded, however they're funded, over the next 20 years. It might be locally funded, they might be small scale, they might be regionally funded, they might be large scale. It's kind of everything that it expects to be. So that's the way we've got it written right now. If we need to make some tweaks, we can do that. But I'm not sure that's a universal practice, what you're doing right now in terms of the financially constrained list. Well, we know it's not, because a lot of places don't even have a financially constrained list in their TSP. So, happy to have some more conversation about that, but it's not clear to me that what we have in our rule is necessarily going to be in conflict with what you want to do or with what Metro wants to do.
The constrained list, is my understanding, is the federal requirement that the NPOs have for their modeling. So that's my understanding, and that's what we select, which projects each jurisdiction, since the Metro, what we would like, what we could, likely, fund in the next, planning horizon. So.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the metropolitan areas have a regional financially constrained list, which we don't. I mean, the state doesn't really have a hand in, right? That's all under federal transportation law. One thing we're trying to do with this is trying to be clear with the local governments, like these are the financially constrained things that we expect. In fact, the other 7 metropolitan areas, Metro is a little bit different. The other 7 metropolitan areas, those are the projects that they're limited to the projects on the financially constrained list, are the only ones they could really bubble up to the metropolitan list. So, but I think of the metropolitan financially constrained list as a subset of the financially constrained lists of all the local TSPs, if that makes sense, right? You've got all the different financially constrained lists across the TSPs, the local TSPs, and some set of those are going to be funded regionally and be on that regional financially constrained list. Metro might be a little bit different. We'll have to work through that some more. Julie, I think you were next.
So tagging on to that, I do think a big part of this confusion is the use of the terms that we're using, financially constrained and illustrative. They have different meanings, and I know that it's been mentioned several times by several people that that DLCD should be using some other terms, especially other than illustrative. And so and yet it continues to be used as illustrative. So it creates confusion that we're talking about the same thing, but when we're really not. The other thing that, tying on to what Joseph was saying is the way I read the draft rule right now, it implies that you need to develop, well, it states that you need to develop a project for every single, gap in your system. That has not been our practice. Our practice has been to, develop project concepts sort of for the, key gaps and, rank those. But there's some other gaps in the system that we just don't currently have a project identified. And yet, for example, the functional classification map still shows that that is a, minor arterial, collector, whatever it is, and that there are improvements needed. And so if a development comes along, we're still going to require them to, do their frontage improvement, even if it's not a project in the TSP. So the way he was describing the connectivity map sounds sort of like it's a map that doesn't necessarily have a specific list with it, but it has enough detail that it can then be applied to development. So I'm a little bit concerned about the requirement to have a project to fill every gap, particularly when you get into talking about the smaller things, so intersection improvements. We often we haven't done the level of analysis that's needed to determine exactly what intersection modification is needed. I guess maybe we can just say this intersection needs something, and then, that's a project. I don't know. So that's sort of one of my issues. I guess it's not a question, just an issue. And then as part of this discussion with illustrative, et cetera, at the regional level, at least in Salem-Kaiser area, we do have an illustrative project list, but even though it's published as an appendix in the RTSP, it is not adopted, approved, anything. I mean, it has no meaning other than just sort of a holding space to know that it's an issue, I guess. Last meeting, I think when I brought up a question about this version of illustrative list, I got the impression that even though we have to develop one, it would not actually be part of the TSP if it's not financially constrained. So I think sort of that distinction about what is in the TSP is important, whether it's in financially constrained or not. Because I do think it's clear at the regional level that if it's on the illustrative, I mean, essentially, it's whatever, doesn't matter. I'm hoping that here we can have a more broad list that is considered to be part of the TSP, but a different category.
I think that's our intention, is to have the illustrative list. Maybe we do need to rename it. Be adopted as part of the CSP, locally.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense that your financially constrained list is going to be different than your regional financial constrained list, because the regional financially constrained list is only on regional facilities. So all of your local streets, many of your collector streets are not part of your regional facility, so they would never be on the regionally constrained list, no matter whether they're big or small. One other thing I've brought up several times, and I don't feel like I've gotten any traction, is related to the clauses that talk about modeling having to include latent and induced travel of additional roadway capacity. I know I've brought that up because we use the best model that's available to us, and it is questionable how good it is at capturing latent and induced travel demand. And I know that I've been told that, you guys are going to work on it, make it better, whatever. But to me, that seems like it really should be in guidance. I mean, we have the ability to use the best tools available to us. we don't have the ability, we're not going to go out and build a new model for our region if what the region has doesn't meet our needs. So, you know, I really would like that to come out. I think it's mentioned 3 or 4 different times and places. And then one thing that I wasn't able to attend the last rec meeting, but I listened to parts of it afterwards. And I thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that in your summary of this meeting, you talked about how some people had and brought up the urgency of making the changes because the TSPs currently were leading us in the wrong direction. Now, I don't remember now if it was under this topic or a different one, but I take a little bit of issue with that because I actually wonder if people know what our TSPs actually say. The TSPs are not the only driver of how the street system ends up being developed. You know, it's tied to the availability of money. It's tied to what we can require of development. It's tied to the marketplace. And so, you know, our TSPs in and of themselves, I actually think call for pretty decent transportation systems. It's just that what you see on the street may not reflect what's in the TSPs. So anyway, I just took a little issue with that. I don't know that everybody actually understands what TSPs say. They see what's on the street. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, and that did come from the meeting notes, and I remember because I reviewed them right before this meeting. So that, yeah, someone did bring that up and put it that way, but thank you. Jana.
Thank you. And thanks, Julie, for your comments. Actually, I think your questions helped me understand some of this conversation better. And I will apologize to the entire group for asking some very basic questions here. But I'm not sure that I have a clear understanding of a big picture, 60-second explanation of what it is you're trying to accomplish here with this. And when I listen and your experts are confused about your terminology, I feel better because I'm completely lost in this conversation. And if you wouldn't mind, if someone would just kind of give me an overview of what you're trying to accomplish, it would be very helpful to me. Sorry, I apologize in advance.
I will give it a shot. And someone can try to rein me in or correct me if I get something wrong. But so we're talking about local transportation system plans, which currently are required for most local governments, except the really small ones around the state. It's basically how they do coordinated land use and transportation planning within their community. So a transportation system plan, you know, all the different pieces of the transportation network within that community in coordination with the land use plan. It's part of the local comprehensive plan. We're talking about making changes to how local governments do those transportation system plans to meet the objectives of our overall rulemaking, which is climate and equity, the big 2 pieces. We want to make sure that in metropolitan areas, transportation system plans are working toward reducing climate pollution and making sure that we're centering the voices of underserved populations and having outcomes that meet the need, that are equitable. So I'd say that's the big picture of what we're trying to do. We're trying to make changes to how local governments in metropolitan areas do transportation system planning to better meet those goals.
I know I hear those words and I could repeat those words. I still don't know what you mean by that. I think roads are fairly innocuous. And so I just don't understand exactly what you're saying. Are you talking about you're trying to create communities where there are fewer roads, narrower roads?
Not necessarily.
I mean, all of the, yeah. I just don't know what you're getting at here. Or are you trying to prioritize the development of roads in certain communities over others? What is it you're trying to accomplish here?
Well, we're talking about the entire transportation system, at least surface transportation. We're not necessarily talking about airports and things like that here.
Right.
But we're talking about roads. We're talking about pedestrian, bicycle, and transit networks, and making sure that we have a complete transportation system that's able to meet folks' daily needs in many places in metropolitan areas without having to drive a car, right? We've done a really good job of building a system where most people are required to kind of drive a car to do most things in a day. And we know the results of that are have been negative for both climate and equity. We know that we need to reduce the amount of driving that's done in our metropolitan areas in order to meet our climate and equity goals. So that's what it comes down to. Now, how do we do that without, with still making sure that we have really nice places to live, that people are able to meet their daily needs? That's what we're really trying to get at the end of the day. Does that mean no one can drive a car anymore again? Of course not. We're going to have less driving overall. That means some people might not drive at all anymore. That means some people might drive about the same as they do now. Just on average, we just kind of need to reduce that. And there's a lot of good ways of doing that maintain or increase, I think, quality of life. And I think that's maybe what you're trying to get at, but I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not 100% sure either, but I appreciate the time you've all given. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Peter Hurley.
I think Bob might have been before me.
Okay, Bob, sorry.
Okay, thanks. I want to just jump in on this question of projects that aren't on the financially constrained list. I think it's important to keep in mind the purpose, or one of the key purposes of the financially constrained list, is to have a set of projects that collectively reduces VMT per capita. So a tweak that makes sense to me, based on the examples that have been put out there, is exempt or allow projects that aren't on the financially constrained list that help reduce VMT. Things like local street extensions or connections that are planned but aren't on the financial list, or bike or ped or pathway projects was one that was mentioned. If we have things that reduce VMT, then fine, those should go ahead. I think the real issue in separating the financially constrained from the illustrative list is potentially big projects that would increase VMT. And those should be looked at carefully to see if they are, going to be on balance helping meet the targets or take you away. So those ought to require amendments. But I wanted to speak more broadly about the question of the financially constrained plan. I'd agree with Julie, we should rename the illustrative list. Let me propose we call it the wish list, because it's a total fiction. It's projects that will not be built in our lifetimes, much less the next 20 years. So they aren't really helpful in talking about where we're going to be. I'm also concerned that the standard for financially constrained plans is much too low. Again, we've proposed that those financially constrained plans should have to meet the 20%, 30% VMT reduction targets that the state has set. The rule proposes a 0%. Basically, if there's even the slightest decrease in VMT, then those financially constrained plans are okay. I think that's a terrible conclusion. It's basically saying we're not going to meet the targets and we're not even going to try. I guess I wonder what the point of this rulemaking is if it results in transportation system plans that don't make progress, don't even come close to the targets that we're meeting. So the question I'd ask for DLCD staff who asserted that this is impossible is, what's the evidence of that? Show me that plans can't get there, because I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the metropolitan plans. Most of them project a 1 or 2% reduction in VMT, and those plans don't account for the state actions called for in the STS that we can reasonably expect are going to help reduce VMT. Plus the fact that these metropolitan areas haven't gone through the process of looking at land use or other changes that could significantly reduce VMT. So again, I think this financially constrained target is much too low. We ought to be meeting our targets and not quit before we start.
Thank you, Bob. Peter.
I do have a question, but I wanted to first address Julie's point about latent and induced demand. The Oregon Modeling Statewide Committee or Collaborative has identified latent and induced demand as one of the priority areas to focus on. And there are 3 entities, ODOT, PBOT, and Metro PBOT, Portland Bureau of Transportation, and Metro, that are going to be working on how do we do a better job of incorporating latent and induced demand into our modeling. So whether that's a separate tool or a component of the regional model, we had identified and agreed that we're going to work together, PBOT and Metro initially on one piece, ODOT on more of the definition of what latent and induced demand include. And so we're going to be working on that over the next year and anticipate being able to, or at least identifying that we want to be able to use that as part of the next RTP update in the Portland Metro region and the update for our TSP, the City of Portland's TSP. So I think there is a work program that's been identified to be able to take some of the lessons that we've learned from other states around the country that are already doing this and bring it into our work as well. So I'm glad you asked the question. It's certainly one that we're definitely interested in, because it's pretty critical to determining whether or not we can hit our targets.
I agree, and I appreciate that. I guess, if Portland is just working on it, it takes a while to filter down into other smaller MPOs with limited staff capabilities. And so my whole thing is, why does it need to be stated in the rule? It's guidance. It's definitely a priority. It's just that I don't know. I don't understand why it needs to be in the rule itself.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. I think we're definitely supportive of it because there is quite a bit of evidence that it can undermine our ability to achieve our climate and equity goals if we aren't adequately accounting for it. So happy to talk to you about what I think is a legitimate question about how do we actually take some of these ideas and turn them into tools that are usable.
Yeah, and I know, Mike Jaffe, I believe, is involved with the, modeling steering committee or whatever. And so, he's the one who's also brought to me a lot of concerns with this being in the rule. And so what I'm hearing you say is that having it in the rule will actually help you. You might not actually do this work if it was not in the rule. Am I hearing that correct?
I think we would probably want to do the work anyway, but by having it in the rule, it gives a sense of urgency and priority that I think is consistent with the potential to either advance or deter our ability to meet our targets based on the research that I've seen. So it's not as if we wouldn't do it, but I think it's one of those items that probably does make a significant difference in our ability to meet or not meet our targets. So question for probably for Bill, perhaps one of the other DLCD staff, is about policies and programs in our TSPs. I think I've mentioned previously that the city is working with Metro and ODOT to do sketch planning on how the heck would we meet the targets 2035 and beyond. And one of the lessons that we've learned from that is that projects alone are not going to get us there, no matter how much bike facilities, pedestrian facilities, transit facilities, and service that we throw at this. It'll make progress, but it won't get us to the target. But what does get us to the target are programs and policies. So things like TDM makes a few percentage point difference. Parking management makes a bigger difference. And then road pricing makes the biggest difference. Not surprise, no surprise there, but there are a number of different policies that if we want to be able to show whether through an illustrative list or a fiscally constrained list that we're going to meet the target, we have to include policies and programs. So my question is, how are you proposing to treat policies and programs in the rules so that we have a fighting chance of being able to hit the target? I know it voluntarily we can do that, but I'm thinking that it deserves a little more attention and priority, since it'll also influence which projects we do or don't do, because if you have, say, road pricing in certain areas, you're going to invest in different types of projects. So just curious as to what your thinking is on how in our TSPs we'll handle the project and policy evaluation.
Yeah, good question. And I think ties into a couple other points that have been made throughout the afternoon so far. I'd say the way we've constructed in the draft rules, the way we could call them our illustrative and financially constrained lists are very project heavy, project specific. They're all about projects that go on this projects that go on the list, and it doesn't really talk about policies and programs like you're saying, and like Joseph was talking about maybe earlier with some of the connectivity stuff, which aren't necessarily, or Julie, not necessarily a project, right? That like, oh, we're gonna make sure that we fill in every little sidewalk gap. And yeah, maybe I think that may be worth revisiting. I think, we're when it comes to the TDM and the parking, I think we were relying a lot on other parts of the rules that say everyone's going to be doing a lot more parking management than they've done before, because that's in the rules now. Everyone's going to have a TDM plan, which they were required to have before. The requirement to do it before was like a sentence in the TPR saying do a TDM. that was the only requirement. Now we have a whole rule that talks about it. So there's a little bit more meat there. But what does that mean in terms of actually things happening on the ground in terms of implementing those policies? I don't think our rule really talks about that much, and maybe that's something that does make sense to put in that list of quote unquote projects. They don't necessarily have to be capital projects, right? Yeah, and this I think also ties into maybe what Bob was talking about, how I think our point has been, like you said, Peter, we can't build ourselves out of it. And you have to take a range of actions, including land use actions, to get there. And so, yeah, I'm not sure how we're going to square that circle yet. I don't know, Cody, you go ahead.
Well, I'll just point out in the VMT target section 0163B, you'll notice that it says it ties into the performance targets in the performance measures section in 0910 and 0915. And so that would be that your projection is supposed to be consistent with performance targets. And that's kind of like I don't want to say circular, interactive. You want to be setting performance measures for the different actions that get you towards meeting the target. And so those would specifically call out TDM and some policy approaches that might not be in a financially constrained list or illustrative list. So it basically kind of lets you take account for and pushes to say, hey, these things are also necessary. So if you see room to kind of strengthen that, I think that's the intent of what we're trying to do there, is to tie together project lists, but also policy, targets for what it's going to take is going to be both. And we recognize that.
I think we're going to have to do a better job of tying that in the project list piece, tying that into those other pieces, just to make sure that the overall we're moving in the right direction in terms of the projects that we're doing, in terms of the programs that we're running, in terms of the land use that we've got, and kind of putting those pieces together. Maybe it's not super clear in the rules right now. Maybe we need to do that.
Yeah, I would encourage that, in part because even with the city of Portland, I think we've underinvested in some of the programmatic pieces that actually activate the projects, because it's one thing to build a sidewalk or to build a bike lane, but if very few people use it, it's not a good investment. But if we do, we find out, we have found that when we do TDM programs in specific areas along with projects, that it does produce more use of the facility that we've just built. So I think there's some complementarity there that would benefit from, as you're saying, Bill, identifying in the project list also programs and identifying what kind of funding we're going to put into those programs, because if we don't put the funding in, it's not going to happen. You can say you're going to do TDM and parking management, but it does require, specifically for TDM, financial incentives if you actually want to make it work. So thanks for the conversation there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And TDM is one of those things, kind of along with transit, that we find difficulty with local TSPs, because there's different entities in different places handling different pieces of that. So we're gonna have to navigate those waters, but absolutely agree kind of in principle there. Paige.
I just want to echo what Peter is describing with the effectiveness of non-capital projects, but the program side. And I often akin that field to preventative health. people who are to do smoking cessation or, become healthier, that you need assistance and handholding from professionals to help you get through that process. And we're asking a lot of people who are going to be transitioning completely away from either a 2-car household or even down to a 0-car household. And the programs are essential to being able to make that transition not as difficult. But I also want to point out that your service providers, the people who are actually providing the travel training or the bike ped safety instruction, should really be considered like a separate piece of this, because they are and will be in multiple locations, TMAs, transit agencies, nonprofits. The requirement, though, to implement a TDM program, not prescribing who or how you get those services, but that you actually have a TDM program, it's very important that that be situated within the TSP, because that is allowing the planning staff to then require that as a development application comes through their department. If you do not source it from the TSP, then the planning department really doesn't have the mechanism to require even a climate friendly area with an overlay zone, with a developer that has an application in. They cannot require that developer to do anything. It's an encouragement. It's a, we'd like to see you do this. And I can tell you from experience, 99% of the time, the developer's not going to do it. So it is very important that we have that, I think, as rule in this process, and that we set it aside. It was previously under the transit agency, and I think I remember seeing that language has now been pulled out as a separate area, the transportation options program as a separate area. It was underneath the transit portion, the public transportation portion of the rule in a previous version, but I think now it's been pulled out separately, which is important, because it isn't going to just be the transit agency who houses those programs, and certainly not the transit agency who will require that those programs be in place.
Yeah, thank you, Paige.
I think my computer's messed up. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You just froze, though. Oh, well, hopefully, Paige. Did you have anything else to add, Paige?
No, I'm sorry. My computer decided to just go on the frets. So, but no, the good timing though.
Yeah,
I was
good.
done.
Good. Thank you. All right, Joseph. Joseph, you got your hand up?
Yes. Hi, this is Joseph off from the city of Hillsborough. Cody shared with me the rulemaking and advisory committee recommendation on metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets, and this was a report that was done in January 2017. I finally got a chance to read it yesterday. Kind of give me more background regarding the TPR revisions to that is identified as section 160 and ties to the Oregon Administrative Rule 660 44. And I guess it gave me the background, but it also gives me more questions. And I'm still trying to process it a little bit more, because I've been responsible with the modeling for the city. So I'm just trying to understand. And I still think what it could, I know in our letter from City of Hillsborough, we just like the LCD have a meeting and kind of give more of a background on this. I'm guessing Metro might have already figured it out how and know more of the background and how to model things. I don't know if the city falls underneath Metro and we'll just rely on Metro on that. But then if that's the case, I do have concerns for jurisdictions that don't really have MPO and how how are they going to do the modeling that is requested? And so I just, and then do they have the background? And I don't know, it's just, there's a lot of unclarity, and I guess I just hoping that, and maybe it I just really think it requires to have another meeting. I know it looks like just this report, just the MPOs met with the LCD, but not really the cities and counties. And I'm not sure how the expectations are for the cities and counties that don't have MPOs.
So just real quick, the rulemaking we're doing is only applying to the metropolitan areas around the state. So places outside of MPO areas we're not changing what they do. This is just within metropolitan areas.
Okay, because the way the rule is currently written, it says city and counties. And so I imply that is every city, like city of Burns or something like that. And so it is responsible for that. And so
yeah, you got to look at Rule 11 to see who does what. Basically, everything in Rule 100 and up is only metropolitan areas.
Okay, thank you for the clarity. I was just so it sounds like so do we just rely on Metro to do the modeling to create to show compliance for 160, or is that the city itself needs to do that work? Cities and counties. I guess my question is basically, is MPOs going to be doing that analysis, or does the city and counties need to do analysis in 160?
Well, I just want to jump in that I have the same issue, because essentially we're going to be relying on the MPO, but the requirement is on us. So who's going to pay for the MPO to do all of the work that's needed, particularly for a different financially constrained list than what the regional financially constrained list is, and an illustrative list on top of that. So it's a lot of work. And so I've asked before, who's paying for that work? I mean, I know you guys have met with the MPOs, but have they said, oh yeah, we'll do this for free? Or is it going to be IGAs between us and our, MPO with money?
So there's a number of questions there. They'll take a stab at answering a few of them. Okay, thank you. First of all, I just want to point out in the RAC packet 10, item 8 is a 2-pager on modeling Q&As from the ODOT Planning and Analysis Unit. And since they do a lot of modeling for the metropolitan areas that are not Metro, Salem, and Eugene Springfield. Joseph, to your question, yes, we expect Metro to be doing the findings on TPR on the new rules, much as they do for the old rules. So a lot of that stuff, we've been working with Metro on that, and they're making findings on climate smart already. So I think that's probably the direction that would go for that 0160 finding to be made through the Metro government in your region. For the other metropolitan areas of the state, it doesn't have to be the MPO, but what TSPs use is the metropolitan level planning model that is hosted through an MPO or through ODOT's TPOW. And we think that these models are already being used for TSP development. I mean, nobody goes and does a new TSP for a city and creates a new model. They borrow a section of that model to hand to their consultant today. So really what we're doing is kind of tweaking the process of how those tools are used. And we've been working with ODOT to make sure that what we're proposing is doable. We also have been a partner at the Oregon Model Statewide Collaborative, or used to be the steering committee, to make sure that we know we're putting policy out there, and there's going to have to be some sort of updates to tools. And that's something that we all feel is a doable thing. This isn't something that's new. Already the TPR calls for monitoring VMT reductions from your plans. And so these tools are set up to look at VMT. We are kind of streamlining the way we measure VMT to, do it in a little bit more alignment with our greenhouse gas target rules. And that is really relying on the statewide transportation strategy, the policies from that, to give essentially, you don't get to take credit, but you get to borrow the credit for them, because the state and the federal government are doing things that are out of your jurisdiction as a city. So we're saying, okay, those are things that will be in place in the future. DEQ just adopted a carbon pricing mechanism consistent with the assumptions in the STS. So we're kind of aligning things, and we think that business as usual will probably go forward. TSPs will use these same models, and those models can be used to do this VMT reduction work. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I hope I hit all your questions there. Julie, you're still on mute.
Thank you. I have some follow-ups. The regional model in our area currently includes the regionally financially constrained projects in the out-year model. Does not include the illustrative projects, the regional illustrative projects. It does not include the, as Bob Courtwright put it, the wish list. So somebody is going to have to do the work to define a whole bunch of projects and add them into a model based on how the rule is currently written, at least as I read it. So I can see the model needing to be run. The base sort of standard model is the regionally financially constrained projects. Then there would be a model run with the locally financially constrained list, which is greater than the regional one. Then there would need to be a model run with the, all of those plus the wish list. And that's the work that I don't see who's going to be doing that.
And I think the answer is the path that is laid out in the rules. Is it something where the city wants to go it alone and do that, and then try to figure out what the other cities are doing in the region to make up those gaps on what's occurring outside of your jurisdiction that's in the regional model? Or do the cities want to work together collaboratively to meet the VMT reduction requirement? And the state is here to support the work, much like most.
So the state's going to pay for all of that modeling work for expanding the regional model, and the MPO is willing to do that on our behalf.
I believe so, yes. I think that the state is already financing the TSPs for the most part that happen in the state. And so this is, updated requirements. But I'm not here to speak from ODOT's perspective on that, but we have been working closely with them and developing this rule language. So
I'm just saying that ODOT has not provided funding for the Salem TSP updates, in, I don't know, 20 years. For the bike ped element, we got TGM funding, but for the TSP itself, ODOT has no financial involvement that I know of.
We're working closely with ODOT, and I don't have anything specific. I don't think I'm allowed to say here that I even really know all the ins and outs of it, but we are trying to identify sources of funding to make sure that we're not asking local governments to do something that's the state doesn't have the resources to provide. I can't. I'm probably being too conservative here, but I don't think I can promise anything. Certainly not a DLCD side of things.
And that's just my concern, is that you're putting requirements on local governments and saying, hey, trust us. Why don't you put the requirements on the state? And, anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, we went down that road internally, thinking about the state doing a lot of this stuff. And I think it came to a point where, our legal counsel was saying, I'm not sure we have the ability legally to do some of those things. Maybe not this particular thing, but there's other things that, we were talking about, like, are we allowed to do that? There are things that, it was really, do the cities really want us, or the counties really want us to do that stuff for them, or they want to be able to make some local decisions, or do they really want the state to come down the heavy hand? There's a balance there, there's a line there, and I think when it comes to the funding, absolutely, we want to make sure that we're doing that. And if it was up to me, like I would just say yes, we'll pay for it, but it's not up to me, unfortunately. So.
And I guess just to finish, one my concern was just that, as I mentioned before, it's just that VMT is supposed to be a comparative measure. It's not really supposed to be utilized as a numerical value, and that's where I'm trying, like looking at this report, I'm just trying to the way the TPR 160 is written, and it's basically trying to make it a numerical number, and that's where I'm just having a hard time trying to understand how we are going to make this as a numerical number. And that one rulemaking report, it wasn't fully clear on that, and I looked at the STS and other reports and couldn't find anything that kind of explain how to make it, how we're making VMT to be numerical now. And I haven't contacted Metro yet, but I was going to try to contact Metro just to try to get a better sense. Like, do they have an idea how they're going to do this? And so that's kind of, if they figured out something, that's great, and we're relying on Metro to figure that out, that's great. If it's the burden is on us, the cities and counties, to figure that out, that's going to be, we need some form of training then. And so that's why I'm just wanting just to throw that out there. But if it's on Metro, then that's fine. Metro needs to figure it out, but we need help if the burden's going to be placed on us.
Well, just two quick comments is that I think we are comparing the future projection to the base year of the VMT change. So I'm not sure what you're speaking to, like the numerical versus the comparative, but that's the intent, is to compare the two, like where are you today, where are you projecting to go? And then we're 100% behind, the guidance and the technical assistance and rolling out what you'll need to do this. Like I said, we're on the model steering committee. We're, advocating for one of the highest priority actions is to support this effort through that group of really brilliant people working on these tools. And so we've been, plugging away at this stuff for some time, and we're fully aware of, the needs here. And we're working as hard on, getting those things solved as we are writing proposed rule changes. So we're making sure that we've got to change the way we're doing things. That's going to be a little bit of work, but we feel like we're confident in what we're proposing is totally doable with the tools we have at hand. And again, if you look at that, the 2-pager in the last rack packet, I think that goes through a lot of the concerns there.
I guess it's just that when we do modeling, we take like the base year, and then we do their projection with the future year, and we use the same type of software, same type of modeler, the same type of input and assumptions. And then we compare the VMT from our planning horizon and a base year, and we can show the reduction that, yes, we are reducing VMT per capita. My understanding of the rule is that it's setting a value now from 2005, but it doesn't tell you what that 2005 value is. And then we're using other models, and so as mentioned, software can change, the person doing the modeling can change, this input assumptions and everything can change. And so it's going to be kind of, instead of having an apples comparison with when you just do your TSP run for the base year and the future year, now you're having apples and oranges. And it seems like there's a number. I'm getting the sense that there's a number in 2005, and I feel like this is probably too technical for this group. That's why I was kind of hoping like a separate group for this, but it's just trying to get a sense of the way it's written. Is like there's a number that's locked in for 2005, and then we're kind of held to creating another number in the for a planning horizon to compare that number to show the greenhouse gas reductions, and that's where.
Why don't we follow up? You can give me a call anytime. But no, we basically the 2005 is, you use the same software, same assumptions. It's just a base year. So that's all. And so you what was the base year VMT using the same ecosystem that you're projecting forward with, then it's the reduction from that point. And so that's the way we've done it with our scenario planning tools. So we've used that software to go ahead and program that. But this probably is getting pretty deep in the weeds. So please feel free to contact me, and we can go help you step through that report.
Yeah, it just sounds like from that, it sounds like it's now the 2005 down to base year, and so we're now dealing with 3 models. So let's talk offline more and get a little bit clarity.
Good, happy to.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else anybody would like to bring up or discuss? Bob?
Yeah, I want to go back and maybe reframe my rant as a question. Again, the standard that you guys are setting for a financially constrained TSP is a 0 or slight reduction in VMT per capita. And you've said that you think that's appropriate because you think it's impossible, I think that's the word you use, Bill, for plans to meet the 20% reduction targets. So I guess a question I'd ask you is, where's your documentation and evidence that it's not possible for metropolitan communities to meet that target? And again, I say that because I've spent a considerable time with metropolitan plans, and they all assume some slight reduction in VMT right now, or most of them do. And they don't account for either changes in land use or the state policies in the STS that should dampen future VMT. So is there something in writing that explains why you think the targets aren't possible? That's the first question. And then if that is the case, where are you at in talking to policymakers, telling them that, gosh, even with these rules, we're not going to end up with plans that meet our targets?
Well, I'll try to start answering your question. Maybe I should just let Cody try. But I think the distinction to be made here is the way the rule's written right now and the financially constrained list of projects in the rule. But I think we've had some discussion today, which maybe will evolve this. Right now is really just a list of capital projects. And my understanding is if you look at most places with the existing built environment, and you look at the amount of money that's available over the next 20 years, there's not enough money to build the good stuff to meet that VMT target. Now, I think what you're saying is right, that there's a host of other range of things from land use to programmatic items, TDM, things like that, toll pricing absolutely could get us there. And we have to have all those things. But I think when you're just looking at the projects, the capital projects in the short term that can be paid for, I don't think you can do it just by doing those things. I think that's what we're saying. Cody, please tell me I'm right or say something else.
So in our strategic assessment work, which has been comparing adopted plans of cities and counties and metro areas with the GHG targets in Division 44, that's what we're using as a VMT reduction target. So our findings, we just got done working with the Albany area MPO, and they can meet the target. Good news, but they can't meet it with something that is funding available to them today. They have a newish transit development plan, which they got for them was a pretty big windfall of transit increases. But the findings found that they would still have to double or triple that level of transit to reach their target, in conjunction with tripling or quadrupling the share of bike mode share and doing infill development. So the targets are built on the STS. When we updated the target methodology in 2017, we streamlined them to rely on the STS work, which was already very similar to the work that was done through Bob and others here on that advisory committee back in 2011, which found that what would it take? These are the things that it would take. They are more aspirational. And so that's where we feel pretty confident that we don't think the amount of money available to local governments today in their planning horizons will be enough. And transit, I think, is the biggest need, is that the STS vision, which the targets are reliant upon, shows that we need a tripling or quadrupling of transit service in metropolitan areas of the state. And those are not going to be financially constrained in the near future. And so putting that target on the financially constrained list would be essentially handicapping folks to get there. We think that there's a lot of good stuff that could happen if you get a illustrative list together that meets the target. That should be a pretty good list of projects. And then the financially constrained would take the largest bite out of that list, and then look at ways to, if a development comes to town and has some money to build something on the illustrative list, then that's great. We're hoping that we have good projects on the illustrative list to take off of that and, put on the ground.
Thanks, that's helpful. But a couple of quick follow-ups. One on Cody, I guess I'd like to compare notes with what I see in metropolitan transportation plans with the strategic assessment, particularly this more recent one from Albany that you've come up with. That's one thing. The other bill is, if I recall correctly, I mean, this has been in the TSP or TPR since it was written 30 years ago, is it isn't just a project list. We're supposed to have a TDM plan that includes significant new TDM measures. We're supposed to have a parking management plan. So the sorts of things that Peter was talking about should be in the TSP and should be the programmatic stuff that helps reinforce these changes as well. So I think we need to account for those things.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, those things are required as part of the TSP. I just don't think we've necessarily gone back and said, putting all these things together, are you meeting this overall goal? And maybe that's the next step.
It should be.
Mary Kyle.
Sarah was ahead of me, but I'm happy to go. I think I'm kind of dismayed at the way that this is being communicated, because in this just most recent conversation, because it's no secret that we're going to need 2 to 3 times at least the investment in transit to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals in the major urban areas of the state. Yes, absolutely. That's what metros already acknowledge as complying. Climate smart strategy shows that it needs to fund the existing TriMet plan for transit service. And since that time, there's been UGB areas added, et cetera. And I'm sure even more than that, but that doesn't make it a not complying plan. It means that, and none of it has ever been just about a TSP or an RTP. This whole exercise we're in is to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets from land use and transportation. We're reducing transportation related greenhouse gas emissions, but this whole rulemaking is focused on the land use, the programmatic aspects, and the projects. And I'm a little concerned that in December, when these rules are going to be adopted in the first part of next year, we're talking about, yeah, we better tie those better together. That's what we're doing here, I thought. So, and I'll also note that the reality that transit funding in Oregon by the state was at the bottom of the national list of transit funding by states, and especially to meet greenhouse gas reduction goals, was a key impetus in getting the legislature to pass House Bill 2017 in 2017, the Jobs and Transportation Act, that greatly increased from the state of Oregon transit funding. We can wring our hands and say it's going to take, we're going to be unambitious because, our project list just isn't going to get there. Or we can say, we're going to do everything we can to meet this. We realize we need more funding. And then that's how we get more funding, frankly, whether it's from the federal government, the legislature, other sources. So I'm just a little dismayed at the overall framing of this. I think Peter and Bob and I thought this whole exercise was about, we're joining these all together. And we should be ambitious and know we might not meet it, but we got to try. And our trying has to be at 20% greenhouse gas reductions. And I also, just looking back at those assessments that DLCD did a few years back of some of the metro regional areas, based on land use and transportation plans and projects then, at least Corvallis was in striking distance of being able to meet its greenhouse gas reduction target. Central Lane and the Rogue Valley were a little farther away, but not impossible, it seems to me, if we bring all these together. And I know you've done some updated ones since then, which should be hopefully getting us even closer. So that's my rant of just, yeah, we're going to need more transit funding, a lot more funding. But that I don't like, I'm just dismayed at how this is being framed. Sorry, Sarah, for jumping in for you.
Sarah.
Thanks. And Mary Kyle, I believe I was actually after you. So I guess I'm kind of hearing two things. One is there's not enough money to continue building the status. Basically, there's not enough money, and there's not enough money to keep doing what we're doing, but also build a bike ped transit network on top of that. That's kind of a gold standard. And I think that's true. And I think that the rules should go ahead and confront that head on. There's never going to be enough money to do that. We don't even have enough money to maintain the existing system. So let's not pretend that there's going to be a magic pile of gold coming. And I think what we have to be confronting head on is that we need to be reallocating space in the existing system. And we also need to be using programs to affect people's behavior and to move people from, sort of elective single occupancy vehicle choices into bike and ped and transit, and using things like parking policy and road pricing and TDM requirements for employers to make it less convenient to drive alone and more convenient to get around in other ways. And that will have huge benefits for freight as well, because it'll get people off the road. So I just feel like this is an urgent moment and there isn't enough money. There is a scarcity of resources, and I hear all the jurisdictions saying that. So I feel like the rules should be clear about that, and to say, given this sort of scarcity, we need to be reallocating the way we spend money. We spend a lot of money, especially with bicycle and pedestrian investments, basically just protecting people from the vehicles. So those are single occupancy vehicle investments when we have to build separate protected infrastructure for bicyclists and pedestrians. And instead of treating those as extras, they should be central. We should be prioritizing those movements, and we need to be using the existing right of way. So I guess I don't have any specific things, but I feel like it ties in what I'm hearing about the lack of money, and also, to the points that Peter and Bob were making about we need more than just building new stuff to be successful. And TSPs really need to face that head on and support making it less convenient to drive alone and more convenient to get around in every other way. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I think we still have a little bit more time. If folks still have other things they would like to discuss, happy to do that. Otherwise, happy to wrap it up. Peter.
Perhaps because I want to end on a somewhat optimistic note, even though I'm not always optimistic, and I certainly don't seek out movies that have fairy tale endings. But I will say that perhaps to the point that several others have made, that when we do the sketch planning work, that there are paths that do get us to the target. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated in this conversation is the combination of, what are the tools that we need to be able to have realistic evaluations of the projects, the programs, the policies, and also the recognition that it is going to require kind of an all of the above approach. It's going to require some good projects so that people actually have alternatives that they can use. It's going to require programs that are actually really cost effective, often giving people financial incentives to walk, bike, and take transit, which also have an enormous equity benefit that we haven't talked about. And some of the policies, which are going to be difficult, some of the policy changes, but they are also doable. And I'm seeing them not only in the city of Portland, but in Beaverton and Gresham and other cities around the state as well. So just I think this conversation and some of the others have been helpful in my understanding of both the tools that we're going to need, but also that combination, which we've been talking about here today, of simply putting together the projects, the programs, and the policies in the TSP to show how far we can get toward hitting the target. And I think in a number of cases, particularly in metro areas, that at least based on what I've seen through the Division of Al work that we've done, both in the metro area, but also in Albany, Corvallis, and in the Rogue Valley, that you can either hit the target or get there if you do that combination of programs, policies, and projects. So wanted to share that perspective, because I've been deep into this for the last several years. The sketch planning work that we've been doing and trying to marry that with the regional model. And I'm actually cautiously optimistic about our ability, both with the changes in the TSP, if we do actually make those connections and set clear requirements, that we are going to lead to a different set of policies and investments that are going to make a substantive difference.
Thank you, Peter.
Bill, I wanted to jump in on one other thing. Several of us had proposed that you set a 2-year deadline for locals to adopt TSPs. And I'm curious if you have, I understood you to say you didn't think that that was workable, but I'm wondering what the additional thoughts the department has on that. If 2 years isn't a reasonable deadline, what are you thinking about, if anything? And let me know. And then I had a couple of other thoughts.
Yeah, we're trying to look through, work with ODOT on funding availability to make that work over as short a time frame as we can manage, and it's probably closer to 4 or 5 years. There are jurisdictions that have recently updated TSPs. That I think there's reluctance there to revisit in the short time frame. But it comes back to resources that are available to make those happen. And frankly, we just don't have enough people, consultants, everything to do. A 2-year time frame would be extraordinarily difficult to pull off.
So the related suggestion that we made was that you require that all housing and transportation plan updates that occur after the rules are adopted make progress in implementing CFAs. And specifically, you've got a requirement in the rule that local governments adopt growth allocations. That's in Rule 340. And I think something that would help a lot is if you require local governments to adopt those growth allocations to CFAs in the next couple of years to guide whatever subsequent plans come up, particularly those regional transportation plans done by MPOs that are done like clockwork, to require that we have those allocations in place. So we may not have a local TSP that gets us everywhere, gets us where we need to go, but let's get started by putting, deciding where future growth is going to go in a way that can help achieve these targets. Do you have any thoughts or reactions to that?
Yeah, Kevin is the expert on the CFA pieces and on the housing side of things and how that interacts with the housing plan stuff. But when it comes to the regional transportation plan, and my understanding is that they need to use existing acknowledged comprehensive plans to make those designations, right, or to make those projections. And if we were doing updates to comprehensive plans to implement climate-friendly areas over the short term, they're going to have to use those regardless of whether or not they've done a TSP update recently or not.
Well, just to clarify again, the proposal is that they would adopt a growth allocation that says, here are the specific areas where we're planning for housing and employment to occur over the planning period, and specifically that allocates to CFAs. so that those would be available. Again, this is something that is pretty much the baseline starting point for a TSP update, is where is future housing and employment going to be located? Shouldn't we be using our best guesses about where stuff's going to be based on implementing CFAs to guide that work?
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Cody.
Well, I believe that's the intent of Rule 0340, is to do exactly what it is you're saying, and you have to combine that, of course, right? And it's so simple here. You got to combine that with the deadlines for designating the CFAs, which Kevin is here and could give some insight there, but I think that's the exact intent of the way that's written.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say that, well, the only thing I'd add to that is that we have a heightened emphasis on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure improvements within CFAs and providing service to CFAs, even regardless of the growth assumptions for those areas. But yeah, absolutely, that's the future we need to plan for.
I guess the question then, or the follow-up, is what's the timing on having growth allocations, given that there are no deadlines, or maybe 4 or 5 year deadlines for doing TSPs? When's that going to happen in a way that it's going to be available to inform all those other planning updates that are happening all the time?
So I think the way it's written right now is it would happen at the time of updating a transportation system plan. And ideally, we are doing climate-friendly areas concurrently with or ahead of a TSP update, and not doing it after a TSP update. So we're trying. Everyone's kind of in a different place right now. We're trying to kind of figure that out. We're trying to put together a kind of a work program concept for local governments to propose a timeline that makes sense to them, but still making sure it happens within the next 2 years. We're also trying to balance that with the available resources to provide to folks to do this stuff when we don't necessarily know what all those are. So it's kind of a balancing act right now. Yeah, Mary Kyle.
So I am not sure I'm hearing, I'm a little confused. This is getting murkier. And I thought that now bleeding over to a little bit the CFA conversation, that in general, the CFA conversation has been about a 2-year time frame for planning for CFAs, maybe in 2 steps, maybe in 1 step, there might be a report, et cetera. And critical to those CFAs would be, it doesn't make any sense to do it if you're not doing the growth allocation in that same process. So that growth allocation to CFAs would be done within that 2-year process, and then therefore be available whenever the TSP timeline is that you all come up with, which is now sounding 4 to 5 years. 4 to 5 years is definitely way beyond any time frame that's been discussed to date for getting the CFAs done. So if I understand what you, Cody, and I can't remember if Kevin's talked yet or and Kevin have said, is that the growth allocation will be done, and I'm not sure where it is in the rules yet, as part of that CFA designation and planning process, somewhere in that 2 years. And then that's available for the TSPs to use in 0340 sub 1, which has no time frame. It just says when you do the TSP. Am I right? Maybe Kevin, that
I guess I'll just
growth
say
allocation is going to happen in the CFA process.
It kind of depends on the context of what growth allocation you're speaking to.
Housing and employment over the time period we're planning for.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at is, I'm familiar with TAZs, right? So that's a transportation planning tool where you're looking at where we're planning jobs, and housing over the long term, and we're going to build our system based on that. Yeah, I think that is happening in the near term once we identify climate friendly areas. So if that's what you mean by growth allocation, I think that's built into that work. You guys, other folks on the team, can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of how I'd envision it working.
Yeah, just to be clear, we expect climate friendly areas to be designated promptly in the next couple of years. I think we're still figuring out exactly the ins and outs and the 1 versus 2 and all those sort of things. But
Right.
Kevin, I mean, in the next 2 years is what we want CFAs to be designated. Isn't that correct still?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, TSPs it's a bigger lift, just resource wise, and to figure out what it is we need to do to do that. And like I said, everyone's kind of a different place. Everyone's in the same place with CFAs. No one has them, right? So it's real easy to figure out like what we need to do for those. I think there's the CFA piece of it, which we will be figuring out exactly where the housing across the jurisdiction is going to need to go, or where we expect it to go over the long term, right? Isn't that right, Kevin? I mean, we need to make sure that's at least 30% within the climate friendly area. So that piece will be there. When it comes time to do the TSP update, they're going to need to look at Rule 340 as part of that. That includes the climate friendly areas, that includes everything else that we're doing, and to say, okay, overall, big picture, what are the assumptions we're making about the future for land use, and hopefully that rule kind of covers it. I just brought it up again because I haven't looked at the rule in a while, but I think the timing issues are tricky because we're trying to balance urgency with the actual ability of local governments to do these things and for the state to resource them. And every time we turn around, there's a new kind of wrinkle in that.
You can't
Cody.
pay for it until you plan for it.
I just want to clarify. I'm sorry. I want to clarify with Bob and Mary Kyle here. It sounds like the rub is that you're flagging the RTP, the Metropolitan Planning Organization plan, to have those allocations prepared for that. And I see that, like what I see a nod from Bob, that there is no deadline in 340 that would trigger that. And so I think that you're identifying a hole there to say, how does that happen? And the tricky part will be, of course, the federal designation. They're following federal regs to be consistent with local land use planning. So how do we operationalize 340 in a way that makes those the official part of the land use map? And so that is kind of, whatever has to happen has to be part of that comp plan designation and those allocations 340.
Yeah, I mean, let's be real. MPOs, and the first step they're doing when they update their transportation plan is they're making a population and employment growth allocation. They're estimating where growth's going to happen. Why wouldn't we want them, once this rule's in place and we have CFAs, to have an allocation that says we're trying to get this kind of growth in these areas? Otherwise, they're doing a plan update that takes us somewhere else.
Julie.
Well, I was just going to, what Bob just said is, that, for example, Salem Kaiser is working on their RTSP update, which is scheduled to be adopted in May of 2023. And we're already working on the land use, allocations now. So even if CFAs were designated within the next year, it's not going to get into the next update of the RTSP. It's, we're 2 years before, a year and a half at least before that adoption. So it will be basically the 2027, I guess it would be the one after that. Just going to say these things take time. And
Climate change won't wait. We need to get started now. Rules are one thing, but we know the direction that we need to go. I would hope Salem uses our Salem, the long-term process that it's been on, to, basically don't wait for CFAs to be legally required, to start doing it now.
Yeah, and so Salem will be using what came out of our Salem, hopefully, but there is a little bit of a rub in that the region has to rely on the adopted plans, right? And so our Salem, we're starting the adoption process. So I can't remember now. I want to say it's around March. There's some point where, there's sort of a line where they have to decide whether to use the current comp plan designations or the our Salem. but regardless, we will work within our current comp plan if we have to allocate growth where we think makes the most sense in alignment with the principles of our Salem.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for that discussion. Well, we've got about 25 minutes left if people want to stay on. Otherwise, if there's another kind of important thing folks would like to talk about, happy to continue on. Without seeing any hands or anything, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time, and Happy New Year, everybody.